Hello and welcome to the AULC Ministries video. Apologize, the video that I took this morning didn't take, so I'm redoing this in my studio, and so it won't be the entire service, of course, but it will be the video. I am Reverend Dr. Robert White, and I'm here as the minister for AULC Ministries. We are a ministry of the Athens Universal Life Church in Crawfordsville, Indiana. Today, we are talking from the Gospel of John, chapter 12, 1-8. Starting at verse 1, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, the one Jesus had raised from the dead. So they gave a dinner for him there. Martha was serving them, and Lazarus was one of those reclining at the table with him. Then Mary took a pound of fragrant oil, pure and expensive nard, anointed Jesus' feet, and wiped his feet with her hair. So the house was filled with fragrance of the oil. Then one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was about to betray him, said, "Why wasn't this fragrant oil sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" He didn't say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. He was in charge of the money bag and would steal part of what was put in it. Jesus answered, "Leave her alone. She has kept it for the day of my burial. For you will always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me." May the Lord add his blessing to the reading of his word. Now, when you're out and about, we don't just use one of our senses. We use several of our senses. And we don't always just see things, but we also hear things as well. We also learn about our world through our noses, through our sense of smell. Some of our favorite smells are like cookies baking in the oven and bread and like that. And there's also the fresh smell of the earth after a rain, the smell of salt when you're near the sea. Think about how it would be to walk outdoors and there was no smells, no scents whatsoever. Your world would seem a lot different, like not being able to see colors or hear music. And with one of your senses not working, it just doesn't all come together. Think about how some smells make you feel. Some make you feel calm and peaceful. Others make you more alert. Others help you to sleep better. And there are so many wonderful smells in nature, like pine trees and mushrooms and grass, and of course all the fragrances of herbs and flowers. Lavender, for example, is used to help people sleep better. Now, people have enjoyed fragrances for hundreds and hundreds of years. Now, we use fragrances from nature in everything from soaps to shampoos to lotions to candles, even in our cleaning supplies. Even the Bible includes a story about fragrance or about smells. Jesus was having dinner at a friend's house when a woman named Mary took 1 pound of costly perfume made of pure nard, anointed Jesus' feet. She rubbed the nard, this perfume made from the oil of flowers, into Jesus' feet. And in that country at that time, people wore sandals. The roads were often dusty. Servants would wash the feet of those who'd been traveling. And Mary, she showed and honored her respect to Jesus by caring for his feet like this. Now, one of the Jesus disciples criticized her and said she shouldn't be using such expensive perfume in that way. And Jesus says, "Leave her alone." The story tells us the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. Now, there are lots of ways to honor God. Mary chose this particular way to do that. Good smells give us so much pleasure, and we give thanks for that. Now, our gospel reading begins in this way in verse 1. Then, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, who had been dead, whom he raised from the dead. Now, in this chapter, immediately preceding our gospel lesson today, chapter 11, Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. The telling of the story is dark, but it has some clues of what's going to follow, what's going to come in the future. When Jesus heard that Lazarus was ill, he says, "This sickness is not to death, but to the glory of God, that God's Son may be glorified." Now, in the gospel, in this particular gospel in verse 12, the glorification of Jesus revolves around his death, his resurrection, and his ascension. Now, when Jesus tells his disciples that they're going to go to Judea, the disciples responded, "Well, Rabbi, the Jews were just trying to stone you, and you're going to go back again?" But Jesus persisted on going. Thomas, one of the disciples, says, let's go also, that we can die with him. Now, Martha confessed her faith in a bold statement. In chapter 11, verse 27, she says, yes, Lord, I've come to believe that you are the Christ, God's Son, he who comes into the world. Now, Mary and Martha was Lazarus' sisters, and the three siblings were among Jesus' closest friends. Now, the cave in which Lazarus was buried, the stone had to be rolled away, and the dead man rising from the tomb, they all looked forward to Jesus' resurrection, which is going to come very soon after this. Now, the council had plotted to kill Jesus because many people, after learning of Lazarus' resurrection, believed in Jesus. Council feared that Jesus' popularity would lead to Roman reprisals, and Caiaphas justified Jesus' death sentence by saying, nor do you consider that it is advantageous for us that one man should die for the people, and that the whole nation not perish. Now, the chief priests conspired to put Lazarus back to death as well, because on account of him, many Jews went away and they believed in Jesus. Now, the author of John here, he says, now the Passover of the Jews was at hand. Many went up from the country to Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves. In this gospel here, Passover will be the killing time in Jerusalem. Now, Lazarus was the brother of Mary and Martha, two important women in Jesus' life. The chapter 11 starts telling this story, and it ends up the passion story in chapter 12 then. Now, John says that Jesus loved these people, these two women particularly. Doesn't mean he had a romantic love for them. The kind of love is agape. It's a kind of giving kind of love, not a getting kind of love. Not much too earlier, Lazarus had been sick, so Mary and Martha, dear friends of Jesus, sent for him. They knew that Jesus could heal people because he was famous for healing people. But Jesus delayed going until Lazarus had died. He explained to his disciples that he had delayed for the glory of God so that God's Son may be glorified by it. Jesus knew that people would glorify God if he healed Lazarus, but they would really glorify God if he brought Lazarus back from the dead. When Jesus finally arrived at Bethany, Martha said, Lord, if you would have been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Now, I hear that as a rebuke. Martha wanted to let Jesus know that he had failed. He failed to respond quickly enough. He failed Mary and Martha. He failed Lazarus, who was not only dead, but now he was really dead because he had been buried for 4 days now. Jesus asked to see Lazarus' tomb, so they took him there. He says, take away the stone. But Martha protested, says, by this time, Lord, he's stinking. There's a stench. He's been dead for 4 days. Now, that's how we know how long Lazarus had been dead at this point. The Jews of that day believed that the person's spirit hovered near the tomb for 3 days. During that period, there was a faint hope that they could come back to life again. 4 days was the same as saying it's hopeless. But at Jesus' command, they rolled away the stone from the tomb, and Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. And Lazarus stood up and came out, bound head and foot by his burial wrappings. Now, Jesus told the bystanders, free him and let him go. That caused many people to believe in Jesus, but not everyone believed. Some bystanders scurried to the Pharisees to let them know there's a problem brewing here. Everyone was flocking to this new upstart Jesus. So the Pharisees and the priests at this time began to plot Jesus' death. They had let him slide way too long. Now was the time for decisive action, and it was time to get rid of Jesus once and for all. Now, that's the background of our story that we read this morning. Later, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus returned to Bethany, as we see in verse 1 of chapter 12 today of our lesson. 6 days before the Passover. Now, what did that mean? It meant that in 6 days, Jesus would be eating a Passover meal with his disciples in the upper room. And the next day, the Pharisees and the priests would kill him. The word Passover floats over this story like a dark cloud. But just how dark is this dark cloud? How dark was the cloud hanging over Jesus and his friends 6 days before the Passover. 7 days before Jesus would die. The cloud was dark, but not eternally dark. As the old saying goes, the dark cloud had a silver lining. But what was that silver lining? To understand the silver lining, we need to remember that the people had just experienced a resurrection. They experienced Lazarus's resurrection. While those people had hoped to see Lazarus in heaven, what they had experienced was completely different. They saw a dead man. He was hopelessly dead, dead for 4 days. Then they seen him stand up and walk out of his own tomb. So Lazarus' death and resurrection at Jesus' hands served as a sign of what was going to come. If Jesus could raise Lazarus from the dead, surely there was a reason to believe that the Father could raise the Son from the dead. There was no dark cloud enough to hide this silver lining. But I'm getting ahead in the story here a little bit. Jesus comes to Bethany, where he earlier raised Lazarus from the dead. Mary and Martha made supper for him. They prepared a meal in honor of Jesus. But it was more than that. It was a celebration of a resurrection. It was a celebration of Lazarus' new life. Now, those of you that's experienced death of a loved one can imagine how Mary and Martha felt. How grateful would you have been if someone had intervened and saved your loved one? Very grateful, I'm sure. In fact, probably eye-wateringly grateful. You might have experienced something almost like that, because sometimes a loved one gets sick. The doctors can't figure it out. You see your loved one wasting away, and the doctors try this and they try that, and nothing helps. Then another doctor figures it out. He prescribes a remedy, and you see your loved one begin to glow with new life, and it becomes very clear that everything is going to be okay. Now, if that good doctor were to visit your home, wouldn't you prepare a meal for him? You'd bring out the best china and the best crystal, and you bet nothing would be too good for this doctor. To get the feel of that celebratory mood, we need to go to the Gospel of Luke, the parable of the prodigal son. The son had dishonored his father and had spent his father's money in wanton living. The father had plenty of reason to write off the son as a lost cause. But when the wayward son comes home, do you remember what the father said? He told his servants in Luke 15, bring out the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet. Bring the fatted calf, kill it, let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive. He was lost and now is found. You get that? For my son was dead and is alive again. Wow. He was lost and found. That's amazing. Now, in just such a spirit, Mary and Martha was celebrating the resurrection of their brother and the return of Jesus to their home. Now, Martha celebrated her way. Well, Mary celebrated her way. Martha celebrated by working in the kitchen and serving dinner, and Martha celebrated to make sure everything was perfect. Isn't that how you would want to welcome Jesus if he came into your home? Wouldn't you want to have the nicest dinner and the loveliest table and the most comfortable chair for your honored guest? Well, of course you would. Martha especially would, because that's who Martha was. Now, I suspect that Martha was the older of the two and Mary was the younger. The oldest child is often driven, compulsive, and a bit too anxious. That's Martha. The younger child tends to be more relaxed, better able to enjoy the moment, even if it's not perfect. That's Mary. There's another story about Mary and Martha that illustrates this in Luke 10. Martha was bustling around the kitchen preparing dinner. Mary sitting on the living room asking or listening to Jesus, and Martha was a little quick to criticize. She says, Lord, don't you care that my sister left me to serve alone? Ask her, therefore, to help me. But Jesus told Martha that Mary had chosen the better part, enjoying Jesus' company, which was more important than preparing a fancy dinner. Now, that was a slap in the face to Martha, and I always feel for Martha when I read that story. In our story today, Martha's once again cooking and serving, and Mary, what's Mary doing? Is she sitting and listening to Jesus? No. Mary brought a pound of very expensive ointment and began to anoint Jesus' feet with the ointment and to wipe his feet with her hair. Martha must have been beside herself. Her beautiful dinner was ruined. How could Mary have done such a thing? And wiping Jesus' feet with her hair? How embarrassing is that? In that time and place, women didn't act like that with any man, probably not even with their husbands. As a matter of fact, most women today probably wouldn't be caught doing such a thing as wiping a man's feet with their hair. But we don't hear a peep from Martha. Martha rebuked Jesus once when she complained that he had failed to get Mary off of the chair and into the kitchen. Martha rebuked Jesus again when he showed up late for Lazarus' funeral. And both times, Martha lived to regret her remarks. Martha decided this time she was going to keep her mouth shut. The party was ruined, but that didn't matter. And Judas Iscariot, decided he'd open his mouth. Martha wasn't going to do it, but Judas probably said this under his breath. And even though he said it under his breath, Jesus could still hear him, and says, why wasn't this ointment sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor? Back then, a denarii was about $100 in today's wages. So that was about $300. Now, we could interpret this as a rebuke to Mary for wasting the expensive ointment, but really it was a rebuke to Jesus for failing to take command of this really embarrassing situation. Now, the author of the gospel wouldn't let that slide. He informs us that Judas was a thief. Having possession of the money box, he was stealing from it because Judas cared nothing for the poor. But Jesus said in verses 7 and 8 of our text today, leave Mary alone. She's kept this for the day of my burial. For you always have the poor with you, but you won't always have me. Now, what's this got to do with us? I'd love to wrap up this sermon with a paragraph that pulls it all together, but I decided not to try that. I spent most of this sermon telling stories about Jesus. I told the story about the prodigal son, the story that Jesus had told, and stories continue to work on us long after they're telling. I'm hoping that the stories I've related in this sermon will come to your mind as you go through your chores this week, and maybe even as you sleep. There are various characters in these stories. There's Jesus, of course. There's Lazarus, the prodigal son, and the elder brother. But mostly these stories are about Martha, really fussy Martha, and over-the-top Mary. As you remember these stories, ask yourself where you fit. Who are you? Are you Lazarus? Has Jesus brought you back from the dead? There are some among us today whom Jesus has saved, and saved in some sort of a dramatic way. Are you the prodigal son, or maybe his elder brother? Two disobedient sons, but disobedient in different ways. Are you Martha? You know, the really fussy Martha, a person who shows your devotion to Jesus by working busily to keep things shipshape? Or are you Mary, the one who listens to Jesus, the one who celebrates his presence in an over-the-top way? Are you Judas, who angrily asked why Mary didn't sell the ointment and give it to the poor? But he only wanted to steal the money. Now, I suspect that we're like one of these some of the time, and perhaps much of the time, but others at other times. That's appropriate. Sometimes we are Lazarus, letting Jesus bring us back from the dead. Sometimes we are the prodigal son, accepting God's forgiveness. Sometimes we are the older brother, staying home and taking care of business. Sometimes we are Martha, doing good things for Jesus. Sometimes we are Mary, celebrating wildly about Jesus. Sometimes we might even be Judas, questioning prolific spending. So who are you? Who might Jesus be calling you to be? If you are to be truly faithful to Jesus, what would your life look like? Think about that, and then let Jesus help you look like that. That's our Lord's message for this Lord's Day, and I hope that you got a blessing out of it. Thank you all for watching. We'll see you all next week.